The year is 1988, and the farmhouse smells like pipe tobacco and old paper. It always had. Even now, 3 weeks after the funeral, the smell clung to the walls the way certain things do when they have been present long enough to become part of the structure itself. Not just a scent, but a record, a testimony written in molecules that no amount of airing out would entirely erase. Eleanor Marsh stood at the threshold of her father's study and breathed it in and tried not to fall apart. She pressed one hand against the doorframe. The wood was soft with age, worn smooth at the height her father's hand had found it for 40 years every morning, coming in and every evening going out until the morning. He did not come out at all. She was 24 years old. The bank had given her 90 days. 90 days to demonstrate a viable farming operation, or the land they held on 160 acres of dark Iowa soil would become something worse than a lien. It would become ownership, and the farm would stop being the Marsh Farm. It would stop being anything at all except a parcel number on a spreadsheet inside a glass tower in Des Moines, one entry among thousands in the acquisition portfolio of a corporation called Agricor Agricultural Holdings. She had seen the documents. She had sat across from the loan officer, a young man in a pressed shirt who was not unkind, but who had a job to do, and she had listened to him explain the timeline in the careful language of someone who has delivered bad news often enough to have developed a system for it. 90 days, viable operation, or the lean converts. She stepped into the study. The desk was covered in journals, 40 years of them stacked in an order that only Walter Marsh had fully understood, though she had spent enough time in this room to have absorbed some of its logic. The earliest volumes were at the bottom of the east stack, cloth-bound and brittle at the edges, filled with the handwriting of a younger man who was still figuring out what questions to ask. The most recent sat on top, their spines uncracked their pages, dense with the compressed observations of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to see more in less space. Her mother had died when Ellie was 7, a swift and terrible winter pneumonia that had taken her in 4 days and left the farmhouse permanently quieter and permanently altered in some quality she had never been able to name precisely, some warmth removed from the light in certain rooms at certain times of day. Her father had never remarried. He had not, as far as she could tell, seriously considered it. There had been women in Creston County who had made it clear they were available for consideration, and Walter Marsh had been consistently and gently oblivious to all of them, which was either genuine obliviousness or a performance of it so sustained and convincing that the distinction didn't matter. It had been just the two of them on this land that had fed 4 generations of Marshes, this land that was now 90 days away from feeding a corporation instead. She sat down at the desk. The chair was his chair, the wood worn smooth in the places his weight had found it over 40 years of long evenings, the right armrest lower than the left from decades of his writing, hand resting on it while he thought. She pulled the top journal towards her and opened it to a random page and read a paragraph about mycorrhizal networks in the Eastfield drainage area and the way the fungal strands were responding to the reduced tillage protocol he had begun experimenting with in 1984. The observations were precise and careful and completely at odds with how any of his neighbors were farming. He had been aware of that. He had not been troubled by it. Walter Marsh had a degree in botany from Iowa State, class of 1962. He had turned down a research position at the university to come home and farm a decision his thesis advisor had called a waste of a good scientific mind, and that his own father had called with the practical directness of a man who had farmed through the Depression, the only sensible thing he'd done in 6 years of college. His neighbors thought him strange in the specific way that rural communities reserve for intelligent people who apply their intelligence to things the community cannot immediately see the use of. He read soil science journals for pleasure. He kept meticulous records of root zone temperatures and subsoil moisture levels and the populations of beneficial insects along his field margins. He talked about carbon sequestration before most agricultural institutions had a file for the concept. He talked about the relationships between soil organisms and plant root chemistry in language that belonged to a research university and not to a farm kitchen in Creston County, Iowa. His neighbors admired his intelligence. They were privately certain it was his greatest liability. He had been all of those things and also right about everything that mattered. She opened the journal to the last page. She had read it a dozen times since the morning she found it on his desk, the morning 3 weeks ago, when she had come in to tell him breakfast was ready, and found instead that he had gone to sleep in his chair sometime in the night and not woken up. The desk lamp had still been on. His pen was uncapped on the blotter beside the open journal. Heart failure, the doctor said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has seen enough of them to recognize one. A heart that had worked too hard for too long, stressed by decades of debt and drought, and the specific grinding pressure that Agricor had been applying to every independent farm within 100 miles of Creston County for the better part of a decade. Agricor had come to Iowa in 1979 with capital and patience and a business model that was simple in its structure and devastating in its application. They bought land, they acquired equipment, they extended operating loans to struggling farms at terms that looked manageable in good years and became traps in bad ones. And the pattern of good years and bad ones in Iowa in the 1980s was not favorable to the borrowers. When farms failed, Agricor was positioned to absorb them. They were not villains in any theatrical sense. They were a business with a strategy, and the strategy was working with the quiet efficiency of something that does not need to be dramatic because it has time and capital on its side. Walter Marsh had understood what Agricor was doing earlier than most of his neighbors, which had not helped him prevent it. He had attended county board meetings and filed objections and written letters, and once driven 4 hours to Des Moines to sit in a waiting room for 2 hours before being seen by a legislative aide who took notes and sent a follow-up letter that said nothing. He had fought in the quiet and methodical way that was the only way he knew, and the fighting had cost him in ways that the farm's balance sheet did not fully capture. She believed it had cost him his heart. On the last page of his final journal in handwriting, slightly shakier than the pages before it, he had written 8 words. The soil remembers what we have forgotten. She traced the letters with her finger. The ink was still dark, still present, still exactly what he had meant when he wrote it. She had been turning those 8 words over in her mind for 3 weeks, examining them from different angles, trying to determine whether they were comfort or instruction, or simply the last thought of a tired man before he slept. Sitting alone in this room that still smelled like him, in the chair that still held the shape of him, she decided they were all 3 things simultaneously, and that the most important of the 3 was instruction. She set the journal aside and reached for the other thing he had left her. Not the debt, not the land, not the equipment that was mostly held together by rust and the mechanical ingenuity of Roy Kowalski. The other thing, the thing she had grown up believing, was her father's great extravagance, his one departure from practicality, and that she, now holding the laboratory report she had paid $70 to run at the Agricultural Extension Office in Millbrook, suspected might be something entirely different from what the world had decided it was. It was a small cloth sack tied with a length of cotton twine. She loosened the knot and poured a handful of kernels onto the surface of the desk. They were not yellow. They were not the uniform machine-perfect #2 yellow dent corn that covered every field in the county like an industrial product that had decided to impersonate a crop. These kernels were a deep and saturated red, the red of garnets of dried wine of old brick, weathered to something richer than its original color. Some were mottled white at the crown where the tip formed. A few toward the base shaded almost to purple, a dark and complicated color that did not exist in any seed catalog Ellie had ever seen, because nothing in any seed catalog she had ever seen had been developed according to the principles her father had spent 15 years working from. He had called it Garnet Crown. The name was his own, invented for his own records for the journals that no one read but him. He had been developing the variety since 1973, crossing old open-pollinated flint corn lines he had sourced from seed banks in Missouri and Ohio, and from a retired farmer in Tennessee who had been growing the same variety since before the war, crossing these with drought-resistant strains from the Ozark Highlands that he had corresponded about with a researcher at the University of Missouri, whose work on heirloom grain genetics occupied a corner of academia so specialized that its annual conference could be held in a mid-sized hotel conference room. He had selected each year's seed from the plants that did what he wanted plants to do: go deep, find water, build protein, resist stress, produce a kernel with the kind of flavor complexity that corn had possessed, Before the commodity market decided that flavor was a variable to be eliminated in favor of consistency, he had not been chasing yield. He had never been chasing yield. He had been chasing the thing that yield as a metric was specifically designed to exclude. He had been chasing what corn had been before someone decided that the market's definition of value was the only definition worth having. The laboratory report said something the market had not prepared itself to hear. She read the numbers again slowly the way she had been reading them for 3 days, looking for the error that would make them ordinary. Protein content 11.2%, more than 30% higher than standard commodity corn. Oil content 6.4%, nearly double. Starch conversion profile exceptional, a complex fermentation curve that produced depth in ways the standard grains simply could not replicate. Sugar profile slow releasing, multi-layered, the kind of sweetness that took time to express itself and rewarded patience in the tasting. She looked at the kernels scattered on her father's desk, red and mottled white and almost purple in the light from the green glass lamp. 90 days. She did not allow herself to sit with the fear for long. Fear was a legitimate response to the situation, but it was not a useful one, and she had grown up in a household that distinguished carefully between legitimate and useful. She looked at the wall map he had pinned there years ago, every field labeled in his careful hand, every slope and drainage line, noted the test plot behind the east barn, circled in red ink with the notation GC, trial beside it, and a column of small stars 1 through 5, recording the quality of each year's results. The most recent notation for 1987 had 5 stars and the single word beside them, ready. She made her decision. It was quiet as the decisions that shape everything tend to be. No ceremony, no audience, no awareness in the moment that this specific choice is the hinge on which the next 30 years will turn. She would plant Garnet Crown in the spring, all 160 acres. She needed a buyer. She needed one before she could plant, or at least she needed the reasonable prospect of one, something more than hope, to carry her through a growing season, with no guarantee of a market at the end of it. She had the laboratory report. She had the land. She had the seed. She had 90 days. She needed someone somewhere who understood what the numbers on that report meant and was in a position to pay for it. In the morning, she would go see Douglas Holt. Douglas Holt had managed the Creston County Grain Cooperative for 19 years when Ellie walked through his door in February of 1988. He was a large and deliberate man, broad through the shoulders, with the settled quality of someone who has found his place in the order of things and occupied it without restlessness. He wore the same Carhartt jacket from October through April. He coached Little League in the summers with the kind of patient consistency that produced over 20 years a generation of young men in Creston County who remembered him fondly without being able to articulate precisely why. He attended the Methodist church his parents had attended, sat in the third pew from the front on the left side, and had not questioned the arrangement since he was old enough to question things. He was a good man. This is important. He was a genuinely good man, and what happened in his office that February morning happened not despite that fact, but because of it. The cage that kindness builds has no bars you can see. You cannot fight it with anger because the person holding it is not your enemy. You cannot argue against its logic because the logic is coherent. You can only walk out of it carrying what you carried in and find another way. He had known Walter Marsh for 30 years. He had known Ellie since she was a child who sat in the truck in the co-op parking lot and read while her father conducted business inside. He had served with Walter on the county agricultural board. He had attended the funeral 3 weeks ago and stood at the graveside in the February cold and shaken Ellie's hand and told her with genuine feeling and genuine eyes that Walter Marsh was one of the finest men he had ever had the privilege of knowing, and he had meant every word. He was not prepared for her to walk into his office 3 days later with a cloth sack of red corn and a laboratory report and the particular quality of stillness that she had about her, the stillness of someone who has already done the grieving and is now working. She set the sack on his desk. She set the report beside it. She did not sit down. She said, "I'm planting this in the spring. I need to know you'll take it at harvest." He picked up the sack with both hands. He let the kernels run through his fingers the way that people who work with grain always do when they encounter an unfamiliar variety the way the hands want to assess what the eyes are seeing. He turned the sack and let more kernels run. He set it down and picked up the report and read it with the attention of a man who had been reading agricultural laboratory reports for 2 decades and understood what he was looking at. He took his time. She waited. She was patient in a way that was not passive, a watching patience, a patience that was gathering information about him while it waited. He folded his hands on the desk. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has chosen each word with care, because he believes the situation requires that care, the voice of someone performing an act of kindness that he is certain will be unwelcome and is therefore being especially gentle about. "Ellie," he said, "your father was one of the most brilliant men I ever knew. I mean that without qualification, but this corn." He looked at the sack. He looked at the report. He looked at her. This was his passion project, his experiment. It wasn't designed for the market, and the market is what I have to serve. The yield numbers alone, the yield is 100 bushels to the acre, she said. Her voice was level. We need a minimum of 108 for a producer to recover input costs at current commodity prices. That's before we consider storage complications. Open pollinated varieties like this have inconsistent moisture content from ear to ear. The test weight varies significantly. I cannot receive this grain in my silos alongside the number 2 yellow that my other members are delivering. It would compromise the grade for the entire batch. Every member of this co-op who is depending on me to protect the integrity of their storage would be hurt by that decision. He slid the sack back across the desk toward her. The gesture was gentle. The finality of it was complete. I can't let Walter Marsh's daughter go bankrupt over a crop that nobody is asking for. I can't take this corn. His eyes were full of genuine concern. She looked at them and understood what she was looking at, a man who believed entirely in what he was saying, who was not hedging or protecting himself, but was by his own understanding protecting her. The certainty was absolute. The kindness was absolute. The wrongness was absolute. And the wrongness was invisible to him precisely because the kindness and certainty were so complete. She had understood somewhere in the 30 seconds after he began speaking that this conversation was over. Not because she had lost it, but because there was nothing in this room to win. The decision had already been made before she walked in. His mind was a closed system on this question, sealed by 19 years of managing a co-op that ran on the rules the commodity market had written, and by the genuine belief that those rules represented reality rather than one particular way of organizing it. She picked up the sack. She picked up the report. She said, "Thank you for your time, Douglas." She walked out. The February air hit her like a correction. She walked to her father's truck and got in and sat there with the engine off. The co-op's grain silos rose above the building in front of her, 3 enormous cylinders of corrugated steel monuments to the uniform yellow product that every farmer in the county was producing, because Douglas Holt and every institution like his co-op had built an infrastructure that only knew how to receive one thing. The doubt arrived as a physical sensation, a cold weight settling in her stomach. She let it settle. She did not try to argue it away, because arguing with legitimate doubt is a form of dishonesty, and she had been raised in a house where honesty, including internal honesty, was considered a form of respect for the actual situation you were in. The doubt was legitimate. She had 90 days. She had a crop that the institution positioned to receive it had just declined. She had a laboratory report that described exceptional qualities in a grain that the market had no mechanism to reward. Maybe Douglas Holt was right. Maybe her father had been a brilliant man whose particular brilliance had been a form of impracticality, so refined it was indistinguishable from vision until it was too late. Maybe she was confusing grief with judgment, inherited conviction with actual evidence. She sat with this for a long time, long enough for the truck cab to get cold. Then she started the engine and drove home. She went inside and sat at his desk and read the 8 words and understood finally that they were not about the past. The soil does not remember the past in the way a person remembers the past, with nostalgia and loss. The soil remembers the way a library remembers structurally, functionally, in a form that remains available. What has been in the soil is still in the soil. What the soil has learned to do, it still knows how to do. The memory is not sentimental, it is practical, it is available. Someone somewhere was looking for what the soil remembered. She took out a legal pad. She wrote at the top, "Who needs what this corn actually is." She underlined the word actually twice. She did not go to bed that night. She worked through her father's library, which occupied 2 full walls of the study, and a third wall in the hallway agricultural journals and soil science texts in seed company catalogs from the 1920s and 1930s. The era before the hybrids consolidated everything, the era when the diversity of American grain was still visible in the marketplace. She pulled volumes and read and took notes and built a picture of a world that had existed before the commodity market decided what farming meant. She learned about distilling. She had known the basics the way anyone who grew up in the Midwest knew the basics: bourbon made from corn mash, the simple equation of grain plus fermentation plus time. What she had not known, because it was not the kind of knowledge that circulated in the agricultural extension office, literature, was the grain chemistry of great spirits. She found it in an unlikely source, a 1963 academic paper on mash bill history in Kentucky, bourbon, cited in a footnote in one of her father's botany journals. The paper described the oil and protein profiles of the flint corn varieties that had been used in pre-Prohibition distilling varieties that had been largely abandoned after Prohibition, when the industry rebuilt itself around whatever grain was cheapest and most abundant. The paper described what those old profiles produced in the finished spirit. The paper described in the dry language of agricultural chemistry exactly what her laboratory report said Garnet Crown contained. She wrote down the names of 6 distilleries mentioned in the paper that had been operating in the early 1900s. She crossed them out. None of them existed anymore. She went to the county library the next morning and asked for everything they had on the current American distilling industry. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Albright, who had known her father, brought her 4 years of a trade publication and 2 books and a magazine article from 1986 about the early signs of a craft spirits movement beginning to develop on the margins of the established industry. She read all of it. By the end of February, she had her list: 22 names. Small craft distilleries in Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia and upstate New York, most of them just a few years old, running on conviction and limited capital, and the belief that the American market for quality spirits was entering a transformation that the large established producers were not structurally capable of navigating. A specialty flour mill in Vermont. 2 academic researchers working on heirloom grain nutrition at separate universities. A food magazine editor in New York who had written about the sourcing practices of serious restaurants. A chef in Chicago whose work with regional ingredients had been written about in a way that suggested he would understand what she was offering. She wrote to all 22. By hand, in her careful cursive on plain paper with her return address in the upper left corner, and nothing to distinguish the envelopes except the wax paper packets of Garnet Crown kernels inside each one, wrapped carefully tied with a small length of twine. She included a copy of the laboratory report. She wrote each letter as if it were the only letter that would matter, because she believed one of them would be, and she did not know which one. Her father had believed in handwriting. He said a handwritten letter communicated intention that printed text could not, that it said, "I chose to spend this time." Every word was deliberate. This is important enough for my hands to be in it. She had thought as a teenager that this was romantic nonsense, the sentimentality of a man who preferred older ways because they were older. She understood now that he had been right about it, in the same way he had been right about the corn, ahead of the language the world would eventually develop to describe why he was right. She sent 22 letters in the first week of March. She returned to the farm and kept working. There was always work. The rejections began arriving in the second week. 3 in the first batch, polite and impersonal, the efficient responses of people who received many pitches and had developed systems for declining them without spending real time on the declining. 5 more in the next week. The large regional distillery in Indiana returned her letter with the seed packet still sealed inside the rejection envelope, which told her everything she needed to know about how carefully they had read her letter. The academic researcher at Missouri wrote back with genuine enthusiasm and no purchasing capacity, a long and kind letter that discussed the nutritional profile in specific and appreciative terms, and offered to connect her with colleagues in the heirloom grain research community. She filed that letter carefully. She was certain it would matter later, though she could not have said how. By the end of March, she had heard from 14 of the 22. Every response was a version of no. 8 had not responded at all. She planted Garnet Crown in the first week of April, all 160 acres. Roy Kowalski had been her father's closest friend since 1962, which in practical terms meant he had been a fixed point of Ellie's entire existence, the permanent presence at the edge of significant events, who fixed things when they broke and said little and knew everything about what mattered and nothing about what did not. He was 63 that spring, a compact and weathered man who had run a repair shop on the Millbrook Road for 30 years and who approached every mechanical problem the way a very good doctor approaches a diagnosis, with the assumption that the system in question has its own logic, and that understanding that logic is the prerequisite to any useful intervention. He came to the farm the second week of April and looked at the old planter and walked around it twice without speaking, and then crouched and looked at the seed plates from below for a long moment. He said, "Your dad's corn is shaped different at the base than number 2 yellow, more angular, more variable. Standard plates are going to crack a significant percentage of the seed on delivery." "I know," she said. "Can we fix it?" He looked at the planter. He said, "I've got plates from a 1957 McCormick in the back of the shop. They were made for flint corn, different era, different geometry. Might be close enough. Let me look." They spent 2 full days working on the planter in the cold of the machine shed. Roy worked and explained as he worked, which was not his natural mode. He was not a pedagogical person. He had learned everything by doing it and had never been required to put the knowledge into words before. But he seemed to have decided without announcing it that she needed to understand the reasoning behind each modification rather than simply observe the result of it, and he adjusted his natural taciturnity to accommodate that decision. She held tools and passed them and asked questions, and he answered with the spare precision of a man making a first translation of something he had always thought in a different language. By the end of the second day, the planter was modified. The plates were not perfect, but they were close enough. Roy stood up and wiped his hands. He said, without looking at her, "Your father helped me once, in 1981. Sylvia got sick. The hospital bills were more than we had and more than we could get." He paused. He was still looking at the planter. "He paid them. He told me afterward, and he told me not to tell anyone, and he said we'd work it out in labor overtime, call it a running account. And he never once mentioned it again." Roy looked at her, then directly, which for Roy was significant. "I figure I still owe him somewhere around 15 years of labor. So don't concern yourself with what you owe me." She planted the corn. She did it largely alone with Pete Renshaw helping when his own schedule allowed. Pete and his younger brother Cody had grown up on a farm that Agricor had absorbed 4 years earlier, and they had been doing farm handwork since then, with the particular quality of people who are still close enough to what they lost to remember exactly what it felt like to have it. They worked carefully. They did not need to be told why, and careful mattered. Her neighbors observed. Jerry Faber across the road stopped his truck at the end of her lane on 3 separate occasions and watched the planting operation without getting out of his vehicle. The Millbrook Diner conversations were relayed to her through the ordinary channels of small community life, not maliciously, but because that is how small communities process events that don't fit the established pattern. A shame. The Marsh place. The girl doesn't know what she's doing. Walter at least understood he was running an experiment. This one thinks she's onto something. She absorbed these reports without seeking them and without responding and without altering her schedule. The spring was dry. Dry in the way that Iowa springs sometimes are, not dramatically but persistently, week after week, of below average rainfall, the soil losing moisture without getting it back, the subsoil drying in layers from the surface downward. By early June, the county had been issued a drought advisory. The hybrid corn in the surrounding fields began to show the responses that hybrid corn had been bred to show under stress leaf curl. At the margins, the faint yellowing at the tip that was the first visible sign of root systems reaching the limit of their range, the slight lean of stalks that were beginning to pull moisture from their own structure because the soil below them had reached the depth of their roots. Her garnet crown stayed green. It was shorter than the surrounding hybrids, darker in color, more varied across the field in the way that open pollinated varieties are always more varied than engineered ones. Because variation is not a flaw in an open pollinated system, but a feature the evidence of the genetic flexibility that allows the population to respond to conditions rather than simply enduring them. It did not look like the corn in the agricultural catalogs. It did not have the uniform wall of green quality that the catalogs photographed, because that quality was the product of 15 years of industrial optimization for visual consistency, not for the kind of performance her father had been selecting for. But it was alive. It was finding water. The root system was the thing. 15 years of selecting seed from the plants that perform best under dry conditions had produced in the garnet crown's root architecture something that did not match the patterns in any extension office chart she had ever seen. The roots went down. They went down and branched and went down again, probing the subsoil for moisture at depths that the standard hybrid root systems optimized for the chemically enriched shallow soil layers that nitrogen fertilizers create simply never reached. Her father had understood this as the consequence of his selection pressure. He had documented it in the journals in careful detail, the year-by-year deepening of the average root penetration, the correlation between root depth and drought performance, the slow and deliberate emergence of a plant that had learned across 15 generations of selection that the answer to surface scarcity was depth. She drove the fence line one evening in late June. She stopped the truck at the point where her property abutted Jerry Faber's, and she sat with the engine off and looked at the two fields side by side in the low-angled light of a dry Iowa evening. His corn was suffering visibly. Leaf curl along 3/4 of the field, some browning at the tips, the early signs of what would eventually be a significant yield loss. Her field was dark and upright and green. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was not available yet and would not be available for a long time, and she had grown up in a household that distrusted premature emotion of any kind. What she felt was something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a person who has made a judgment based on evidence, and is watching the evidence continue to behave as the judgment predicted. It was confirmation, not triumph. Confirmation was better. Confirmation was useful. When she got back to the farmhouse that evening, there was a letter in the mailbox with a Kentucky postmark. She recognized the return address. She had written to it 2 months ago. Delaney Craft Spirits, Louisville, Kentucky, established 1986. She opened it at the kitchen table. 2 pages of handwriting, quick and forward-leaning, slightly angular, the handwriting of someone whose thinking moves faster than their pen and who has made a partial accommodation to that fact by compressing the letter forms. His name was Marcus Delaney. He was 28 years old. He had left an accounting position in Chicago 18 months earlier to start a distillery with his brother Thomas, using a family recipe that had belonged to his grandmother in a business conviction, which he stated without apology in the letter that the American craft spirits market was approaching a transformation that the large established producers were not structurally capable of navigating, and that the opportunity for a small, quality-focused operation that genuinely understood provenance and ingredient character was significant and probably time-limited. He had read her letter twice. He had examined the seed packet under magnification. He had sent a portion of the sample to a grain analyst he knew at the University of Louisville. The results had prompted him to want to know more. He could not promise a contract, he wrote. He was not in a position to commit to a sourcing arrangement without seeing the crop in person and verifying the harvest quality. But he was willing to come to Iowa in October and evaluate the harvest himself, and if what he found matched what the laboratory report described, he believed they should have a serious conversation about a long-term arrangement. At the bottom of the second page, written in a slightly different pressure, as if added after a pause, he had written, "I noticed you sent this letter by hand. I tried to respond in kind. I think that probably says something useful about both of us." She read the letter 3 times. It was not a contract. It was not a commitment. It was the narrowest possible sliver of an opening, and the wall she had been pushing against for 3 months was made of closed doors, and this door was not open, but it was also not locked. She sat at her father's desk under the green glass lamp. She did not let herself feel too much about it, because too much feeling in a direction uses energy that belongs to the work. She picked up a pen. She opened the journal to the page where she had written her 8 words below his 8 words, and she read them both together. "The soil remembers what we have forgotten. I planted it. Now I have to learn to grow it. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning, there was more work. The summer deepened and dried, and the garnet crown did what it had been bred over 15 years to do. It went through the July heat without curling. It went through August without the browning that was appearing across the county's fields in patches that were becoming harder for the extension office to characterize as localized stress rather than systemic failure. The drought advisory became a drought declaration. The county's projected aggregate yield dropped by 30%, then 35%. Jerry Faber's corn came in at 60% of his projected yield in mid-October. He did not stop at her lane anymore to watch. She spent the summer learning. She read everything she could find about fermentation chemistry and the role of grain oil and protein profiles in spirit production. She drove to the county library twice a week. She called Professor Elwood at the University of Missouri, whose letter had expressed genuine enthusiasm about the garnet crown variety, and she had 3 long phone conversations with him about the botanical history of flint corn in America and the specific biochemical properties that her father's selection process had been developing. Elwood was generous with his time and his knowledge and his contacts, and he gave her 2 additional names in the academic world that she followed carefully. She was building a picture. She was assembling the knowledge she would need to have the conversation with Marcus Delaney in October as something more than a farmer showing a buyer her yield. She intended to understand the chemistry of her own product well enough to explain it to someone who was building a business around it, because that understanding would make the relationship more durable than any contract language could. Marcus Delaney arrived in the first week of October in a pickup truck that was newer than anything on the Marsh farm and stopped at the end of the paved section of the lane where the county road met her gravel and sat for a moment with the engine running before shutting it off. He was younger than she had pictured, from the letter narrower through the shoulders, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who process information primarily through observation and have learned not to speak before the observation is complete. He walked her fields for 40 minutes without saying much. She accompanied him at a distance that gave him room to think close enough to answer questions, far enough not to be a presence he had to perform for. He moved through the rows with his hands in frequent contact with the plants, touching stalks and leaves and ears, with the systematic tactile assessment of someone who has trained himself to read grain the way other people read text. He pulled a cob from a stalk and broke it open with both hands and held the halves up and looked at the exposed kernels in the October light, the deep red and mottled white, the almost purple at the base. He smelled the broken surfaces. He chewed a raw kernel slowly and stood in the row looking at nothing in particular, processing what his mouth was telling him. He looked at the root system of a plant he pulled carefully from the ground. He held the plant upside down and looked at the root architecture for a long time. He set it down carefully, the whole plant, not just the ear, as if the root system were part of the specimen rather than something to be discarded. When he came back to where she stood at the field margin, he said, "The drought, how much did it hurt you?" "It didn't," she said. He was still for a moment. "Final yield per acre, 98 bushels. She watched him run the number through the standard calculations. 98 was below Douglas Holt's threshold. It was below the minimum for commercial viability and on commodity pricing. She let him finish the calculation. "Jerry Faber across the road grows commercial hybrids," she said. "He came in at 112 this year." Marcus looked at her. "Normal year he'd have done 220, she said. "The drought cut him by half. My yield fell by 2 bushels from my father's test plot projections. The drought didn't reach us because we went down to where the water was." She paused. "Your product isn't competing with what this corn does in a good year. It's competing with what it does in a bad one. There are more bad years coming." She said this as a statement of agricultural fact, which was what it was. She had read the climate data her father had been tracking in his journals since the mid-1970s, the gradual shifts in precipitation patterns and temperature ranges that the standard agricultural models for her region were not yet fully incorporating. She did not say any of this to Marcus Delaney because she did not need to. She had said enough. He went back to his truck and took out a portable grain quality instrument, a device she had not seen before, and asked if he could take a sample to the grain bin. She let him there. He ran the test and read the numbers and stood with the readout in his hand and did not speak for a long time. 4 times commodity market rate, he said, for everything in this bin, cash at delivery. She felt the release of something that had been held tight in her chest since February. She did not show it. She said, and next year, a contract, 2 years minimum, double the acreage if you can manage it. I'll have 320 acres in the spring, she said. Earl Halverston to my south is retiring. He'll sell. I can put up a down payment to help you secure it. No, she said. You pay at harvest. Always at harvest. I don't farm against a debt I owe to my buyer. The crop is ready, or it isn't, and we settle at harvest. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention of someone who has just understood something about the person they're talking to that changes the nature of what they thought this meeting was. He put his hand out. At harvest. She shook it. She walked him back to his truck at the end of the afternoon. He stopped at the driver's door and said, the journal sections you mentioned in your letter, the root system development. Would you be willing to send me copies? I'd like to understand the breeding history. The fermentation implications in that starch profile are unusual and I'd want to know where they come from. She considered it for a moment. I'll send copies, she said. The originals stay here. Of course, he said, immediately, without qualification. She noted that. The bank was paid in full on November the 3rd, 22 days before the deadline would have forced a different kind of conversation. She drove to the branch office in Creston and placed a cashier's check on the loan officer's desk. He looked at the check. He looked at her. She thanked him and left. She bought the Halverston property before Christmas. Cash at a price she set at fair value rather than at the depressed market value that Earl Halverston's age and isolation and the general decline of independent farm property values in Agricor's operational radius would have justified. She offered him a lifetime lease on the farmhouse at a nominal rent that he would never have to think about. He shook her hand without negotiating. She knew she had offered too much by the calculation of strict market fairness. She did not adjust the offer because Earl's grandfather and her great-grandfather had shared a fence line for 30 years, in a period when that kind of sharing built things that market calculations did not know how to price. She hired Pete and Cody Renshaw as full-time employees. She paid them wages that were above what they could have earned elsewhere in the county, not as charity, but as a deliberate decision that good work deserved good compensation, and that the people she needed to trust with her father's corn needed to have a reason to stay. Pete's wife started helping with the books 2 days a week. Cody proved to have an instinct for soil that showed itself in how he walked fields, the way he noticed things before they became problems, the way he seemed to listen to the ground in the same manner Roy Kowalski listened to engines. In the spring of 1989, she planted 320 acres of Garnet Crown. Marcus Delaney and his brother Thomas were building their distillery with the specific intensity of people who have committed everything to an idea and are discovering that the idea has more structural integrity than they initially gave it credit for. The first barrels of Garnet Crown bourbon went into the Rick House on Milner Street in Louisville in the fall of 1989. Marcus had recruited a master distiller named William Foss, a man with 42 years in the Kentucky spirits trade who had learned distilling from his uncle in a small operation outside Bardstown, and who had worked since then in 3 of the major established houses, always as the person who knew what the product was supposed to taste like, and sometimes as the person who argued with the corporate managers about whether the product was allowed to taste like that. Foss ran his own analysis of the Garnet Crown mash. He called Marcus the next morning and said with the directness of a man who has stopped softening statements as a courtesy to people's feelings that the oil profile was unlike anything he had formulated within 40 years, that the starch conversion curve suggested a fermentation character that would produce complexity and persistence in the finished spirit that he had not tasted in American whiskey since the mid-1960s, when an operation in Bardstown had still been using similar grain before the conglomerate that bought them standardized the mash bill for efficiency. He said with the caution of someone who has been burned by promising grain before, that if the supply was consistent, the product would be unlike anything currently available in the American market. Foss was not given to overstatement. Marcus sent Ellie a copy of his analysis with a note that said simply, "He doesn't say things like this." The corn was consistent. She made it her job to ensure it was consistent. She spent 2 seasons working directly with Pete and Cody on the specific cultivation practices that her father's journals described: the particular tillage timing, the spacing, the way the seed needed to go in slightly deeper than standard to accommodate the root system's development pattern, the cover crop rotation that built the soil, biology, the garnet crown's mycorrhizal relationships depended on. She kept records in the same format her father had used, the same notebooks from the same stationery supplier in Des Moines, the same shorthand notation system she had learned reading over his shoulder as a child. The records were not sentimental, they were operational. The journals were a living system updated each season, cross-referenced with the previous year's observations, building into a body of knowledge about this specific land and this specific crop that no extension agent and no corporate agronomist had, and that could not be purchased or replicated quickly. The contract from Marcus arrived in March of 1990. She read it twice the way she read everything, looking for what was not said as carefully as for what was. The language was precise and clearly the work of a careful attorney. The pricing formula was exactly as they had agreed. The term was 2 years with an automatic renewal provision subject to mutual agreement. Near the end of the document, she found 3 paragraphs she had not expected and had not asked for. They addressed intellectual property. They stated that in any matter pertaining to the ownership or genetic rights of the garnet crown variety, the seller, Eleanor Marsh, retained all claims. The buyer agreed to support at the buyer's expense any documentation or registration process the seller pursued to establish and protect those rights. She called him. This provision, she said, the intellectual property section. Yes, I didn't ask for it. I know. So explain it. He said, I've been talking with a patent attorney about what happens when a large agricultural corporation decides it wants access to a variety like garnet crown and simply takes the genetic material. The legal situation on open-pollinated heritage varieties is less protective than it should be. The genetics are essentially public unless they're formally registered. Anyone can acquire seed, reproduce it, make modifications, and claim it as a proprietary development. Your father's 15 years of work that has no legal protection right now. A pause. I'd like to help you change that. The USDA has a plant variety protection program that can register the garnet crown line in your father's name as the original developer. It takes time and documentation, but once it's registered, no corporation can appropriate the genetics without your consent. She considered this. Why are you doing this? The pause before his answer told her he had thought carefully about what the honest answer was. Because I need this corn to still be yours in 20 years, he said. If Agricor or a company like them gets control of the genetics, they can produce a commodity version of it that undercuts everything we're both trying to build. Your legal security is my commercial security. Another pause. And your father's work deserves to be documented in his name. That's the other reason. Both reasons are real. She agreed to the plant variety protection process. She did not know yet how much that decision would matter. She did not know what was already being organized in offices she had never seen by people who had run an analysis of Garnet Crown's profile and understood what the numbers meant and had their own ideas about how to obtain access to what the numbers represented. She found out in November of 1992. The 2 years between the contract signing and that November had gone well in the careful and incremental way that good things go when they are built on substance. The summer of 1990 was adequate in rainfall. The summer of 1991 was another drought year, and the Garnet Crown again outperformed the surrounding fields' stressed hybrids. Marcus's distillery won a regional spirits award in 1991, the first of several, and a review in a New York spirits publication described the Garnet Crown bourbon's flavor as recalling something that had been largely absent from American whiskey for decades, a specific combination of oil and depth and slow sweetness that the reviewer associated with older traditions and could not quite account for in a 2-year-old Louisville operation. The review brought attention. Attention brought orders. Orders brought the need for more supply, and Marcus wrote her in the spring of 1992 asking whether she could add acreage. She was already farming 320 acres. She had been watching the property situation on her western border, a 300-acre parcel that had been in the Kellerman family for 4 generations, And that was under pressure from an Agricor operating loan, whose terms she had heard described secondhand as aggressive. She told Marcus she was monitoring a possibility and would know more by fall. She was still monitoring that possibility in September of 1992, when the phone rang on a Tuesday morning, and everything she had built came within a significant distance of coming undone. Thomas Delaney's voice was wrong before the words arrived, the specific, compressed quality of someone who has been managing bad news for hours and has not yet found a way to make it smaller than it was. The fire had started in the Rick House on Milner Street sometime after midnight. The distillery building itself was intact. William Foss was fine. Marcus was physically unhurt, but had been at the site since 4 in the morning and had not slept. The Rick House, where 3 years of aging product was stored, was gone. The garnet crown barrels, the aged inventory, the production that represented 3 years of work, and the financial foundation of the next 2 years of operations, all of it was gone. The insurance adjuster had arrived that same morning and had immediately begun asking questions about the electrical inspection records from the installation 2 years earlier. There was a discrepancy in the documentation. The resolution could take 18 months, could take longer. "We can't pay you for this year's harvest," Thomas said. "I don't know another way to say it." She sat down. Through the kitchen window, the September fields were tall and dark and 40 days from harvest. She looked at them for a moment. She said, "Tell Marcus to call me this evening when he has a moment." She hung up. She did not allow herself to sit with it for long because sitting with it served no function. She inventoried her actual situation. Without Marcus's payment, she had operating reserves for approximately 1 growing season. She had 3 full-time employees to pay. She had equipment maintenance costs and property taxes and lease payments. She had in the background of all of this Agricor, which had been watching her with a patience she had come to respect as a strategic quality. Marcus called that evening. He had been awake for 17 hours and his voice showed it, but underneath the exhaustion there was something more troubling, the voice of a man who is calculating how to take a responsibility that is not his to take. He started with the apology and the plan. Refinancing the building, personal credit, investors. He would make it right. He would find a way. She let him finish. Then she said, 3 questions. Is the distillery equipment intact? Yes. Does Foss still have what he knows, every bit of it? Do you still want this corn? He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had settled into something beneath the exhaustion, something more fundamental. More than anything I am working toward. Then here is what is going to happen, she said. You'll take this year's harvest on deferred payment, 18 months out or sooner if your insurance settles before then. You change nothing about the production. You keep Foss. You keep the formulation exactly as it is. No corners get cut in the production because the corners are the product. Ellie, you didn't ask me, she said. I decided. Those are different things. What she did not tell him was that carrying this decision had real costs. On her side of it, costs she could manage, but only barely, and only by being very careful and very patient for a longer period than she had originally planned. She had learned from her father that the sharing of a burden's full weight was not always an act of honesty. Sometimes it was an act of transferring anxiety that did not improve the situation, but only distributed it more widely. She would carry what she could carry. If it became more than she could carry, she would tell him then. In November of 1992, Gerald Pryor arrived. He had a state agricultural department vehicle and proper identification and a clipboard in the humorless manner of someone operating under specific instructions. He informed her that a concern had been filed regarding the commercial distribution of uncertified plant varieties. He explained that the garnet crown corn, moving in commercial channels without state certification, might be in violation of Iowa seed statutes. He indicated that the department had authority to impound suspect seed stock pending investigation. He looked at the grain bin with professional interest. She looked at him and felt beneath her stillness the particular cold clarity of someone who has just understood the shape of a threat. She asked who had filed the concern. He was not at liberty to say. She asked about the contestation process. He outlined it. She told him she would need to consult her attorney before permitting access to storage facilities, which was within her rights. He confirmed it was, gave her a formal notice, and left. She stood in the driveway for a long time after his vehicle was gone. She looked at the grain bin, 16,000 bushels of garnet crown, next year's seed supply, the genetic record of her father's 15 years of work, the foundation of everything. If it was impounded under an investigation that could be extended indefinitely by whoever had filed the original complaint, she would have 320 acres in the spring and nothing to put in the ground. She called Marcus. She told him everything precisely and without embellishment. When she finished, he said, "Give me 72 hours. Don't communicate further with the department. Don't allow anyone on the property. I'll explain when I call back." She spent the 72 hours working. Fence repair on the north border. Full service on the combine. Seed sorting with Pete in the old sorting shed, a task that required enough hand and eye coordination to keep the surface of her mind occupied while the deeper layers turned the situation over and looked at it from different directions. She cooked each evening the kind of cooking that produced something definite: bread and cornmeal, and the particular slow-cooked bean dish her father had made on cold Sundays. On the third morning Marcus called, his voice had the quality of someone who has resolved something. In January of 1990, and he said, "I filed a plant variety protection application for the garnet crown variety. I've been managing the documentation process with the attorney. I didn't tell you because I wanted to wait until it was complete." A pause. "The certificate was issued 6 months ago. I've been waiting for the right moment, and this is obviously not the right moment, but it is the only one available." She sat very still. "Garnet crown is PVP, registered in your father's name," Marcus said. "The impoundment authority doesn't apply to PVP protected stock. Your attorney files a response citing the certificate and the investigation stops. And if Agricor is behind the complaint, which my attorney believes they have now created a documented record of commercial interference with a federally protected variety. That is a substantially different legal situation than the one they intended to create." She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her father's journals on the shelf. 40 years of notebooks, 15 years of garnet crown, all of it now documented in his name, protected in the law, because a young man from Louisville had read her letter about root systems and decided that protection was something the work deserved, and that if no one else was going to arrange it, he would. "Marcus," she said, "when did you start this?" "January of 1990, after you sent me the copies of the journals. After I understood what your father had actually built over 15 years. He paused. "I thought if this is what I believe it is, someone needs to protect it. You were keeping the farm alive. You didn't have the time or the resources for federal registration filings. So I did it." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Thank your father," Marcus said. "I filed paperwork. He did the work." The investigation was withdrawn within 30 days. The response her attorney filed citing the plant variety protection certificate was apparently sufficient to cause whoever had initiated the complaint to recalculate the situation. The State Department sent a letter of apology. She filed it. Agricor went quiet. She understood this as strategic recalibration rather than retreat. And she was right. But the recalibration took time. And in that time, she planted her spring crop and delivered her harvest. And Marcus's insurance settled in 14 months, and he paid her with a check that included the contractual interest provision she had not asked for, but that was in the contract because he had put it there. The Kellerman farm went to auction in the spring of 1994. Agricor sent a representative. She attended with a certified check. She kept her hand up. Agricor's representative eventually stopped raising his, and the auctioneer declared her the buyer, and the room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has happened that requires a moment to absorb. 640 acres, no debt. The corn growing from seed whose genetic rights were documented in her father's name. Roy Kowalski coming 3 days a week, moving more slowly, but still moving, still listening to engines the way he had always listened to them, with the patience of someone for whom mechanical failure is a communication to be understood rather than a problem to be defeated. The 1990s passed in the rhythm of work, planting and growing and harvesting and planning the next planting. The craft spirits movement arrived gradually, the cultural shift toward provenance and story, and the specific character of things made carefully from ingredients that had their own history. Her father had been writing about these ideas in his journals in 1974, when the market had no language for them. The language arrived slowly in food publications and restaurant reviews and the specialist spirits press. And as the language arrived, it described with increasing precision exactly what Marcus Delaney's distillery had been producing for a decade. The awards accumulated. The reputation built. Marcus kept Foss at the center of production and kept the Garnet Crown mash bill unchanged and kept the pricing arrangement with Ellie unchanged. And the product that resulted from all of this consistency was by the early 2000s recognized in the specialist spirits world as something genuinely unusual. A bourbon whose flavor profile could not be replicated by any of the large producers because it derived from a grain that none of them had, and that was by federal registration hers. In 2008, Hartwell Spirits International sent representatives to Louisville. They were one of the 5 largest spirits conglomerates in the country, and they had been studying Delaney Craft Spirits for 3 years with the patient analytical attention of a large company that knows how to identify what it cannot manufacture internally and is considering acquisition as an alternative to imitation. Marcus called Ellie the evening after the first meeting. "The number is real," he said. "They're serious." "What are your conditions?" she said. "One condition," he said, "a 30-year supply contract for Garnet Crown at the pricing formula we've always used written into the acquisition agreement as a non-negotiable term. If they don't agree to it, I don't sell." She said, "Marcus, that's a significant amount of leverage to use on my behalf." "Without Garnet Crown, the brand is different," he said. "They know that. Their own agricultural economist told them that. I'm not using leverage. I'm stating a fact and building the contract around the fact." The negotiation took 4 months. Hartwell sent Dr. Patricia Burke, an agricultural economist, to examine the farm. She was thorough and skeptical in the way that competent people are when they are being asked to value something that doesn't fit their standard models. She spent 2 days on the farm with soil probes and root samples and very precise questions about yield history across drought years and normal years, and the specific correlation between root depth and oil content that her father had documented across 15 years of selection. She asked to see the plant variety protection certificate. She asked about the farming protocol in detail. She took extensive notes and flew back to Connecticut and reported to Hartwell's board. The deal closed in the spring of 2009. The supply contract provision was as Marcus had specified: 30 years, her pricing formula, her operational autonomy, and one additional clause that Marcus had added to the final draft without telling her. It stated that Hartwell agreed to designate Eleanor Marsh as sole consultant and advisor on all cultivation decisions related to Garnet Crown, and that no modifications to farming protocol or sourcing arrangements could be made without her written agreement. She called him when she read it. "Written veto authority over a Fortune 500 company's agricultural decisions," she said. Yes, they agreed to this. Their agricultural economist told them that the product's quality derives from the farming methodology and that the farming methodology lives in one person's knowledge and judgment. They agreed because the alternative is losing the thing they just paid to acquire. He paused. "Also, I told them it was non-negotiable." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about a letter she had found in her father's files in the winter of 1988, filed under the rubber ban with the 1983 and 1984 correspondence. A letter from Douglas Holt written to Walter Marsh in 1984. She had read it once. She had put it back where she found it. She had not thrown it away. Hartwell's need for expanded supply became apparent within 18 months of the acquisition. The brand's growth in the national market was accelerating beyond what her farm alone could supply. Brian Stokes, Hartwell's regional supply manager, came to Iowa with expansion projections and a proposal about licensing the Garnet Crown genetics to commercial-scale growers under a supervised program. She looked at his projections. She listened to his proposal. She let him finish. She said, "In 5 years, what you're describing produces a grain that tests differently from what you bought." He waited. "Commercial volume growers on multi-year contracts optimize for yield," she said. "They will push nitrogen. They will shorten rotation cycles. They will take shortcuts that each individually seem small and that collectively over 5 years degrade the root system development that produces the oil profile your product is built on. You'll end up with a bourbon that's in the same market category, but no longer in the same quality category. The story becomes a lie. He was quiet for a moment. What's your alternative? I select the growers, she said. I train them personally. They follow the protocol exactly. Their pricing comes through me, not through a Hartwell purchasing department, and the premium reaches the farmers rather than the supply chain overhead. He went back to Connecticut. He came back 2 weeks later and told her Hartwell had agreed. The contract provision requiring her consent to cultivation changes had made the agreement straightforward. She selected 7 farms. She chose them over several months, visiting each one, walking the fields, spending time with the families. She was looking for a combination of qualities that she could not fully articulate, but that she recognized when she encountered it: families with deep knowledge of specific ground under financial pressure, significant enough to make a real alternative genuinely meaningful, with the capacity to learn a different way of doing things and the willingness to do so without cutting corners when no one was watching. The Pendleton Farm in Jefferson County, the Garrity operation outside Ames, James Kowalski, Roy's nephew, who had taken over the family land after Roy's health made active farming impossible, who had learned from Roy the same quality of patient attention to systems that Roy had learned from his own years of fixing things. 4 others, each chosen with the same care. She gave them the seed. She visited each farm multiple times the first season, walking fields and answering questions and demonstrating the specific observations that her father's journals described and that she had spent 20 years learning to make automatically. She negotiated their contracts with Hartwell, directly ensuring that the premium reached the farmers at a level that made real financial difference, that it saved the farms it was supposed to save. She was building the thing her father had been trying to build. Not a farm, not a business exactly, though it had become that. An argument. An argument made in the most durable language available, the language of soil and grain and living systems. And the long-term economics of doing things right when doing things right is more expensive than doing things wrong in the short term and cheaper than doing things wrong in the long term. The argument said what the market calls junk is sometimes the most valuable thing in the room, and the person who believes the market has a comprehensive account of value is working from an incomplete model. Roy Kowalski died in the winter of 2012. James called her the morning after. She sat at her father's desk for an hour without moving, looking at the journals on the shelf, thinking about a man who had paid hospital bills without being asked and considered the debt from that payment a 30-year obligation. She went to the funeral. She stood with the family. She did not speak because there was nothing that needed to be said in words. Douglas Holt retired from the Creston County Grain Cooperative in 2015. The co-op had been declining for years, caught between falling commodity prices and corporate consolidation, and the gradual disappearance of the independent farming operations that had been its membership base. He retired to fish and attend his grandchildren's events and to try, with partial success, not to think about the co-op and what was happening to it. He was brought back as an informal advisor in the spring of 2018 when Brian Stokes approached the co-op's new director about becoming a distribution hub for the expanding Garnet Crown supply network. The new director, who had not been there for the relevant history, found Douglas's knowledge of the region and its farming relationships indispensable and consulted him on the proposal. Douglas understood within minutes of reading it what it meant and what it required. He sat with that understanding for 3 days. He looked at the co-op's actual financial situation, which was considerably more precarious than the numbers he had seen as a manager had suggested, because he had been in his final years unconsciously moderating his view of those numbers. He looked at what the Hartwell relationship could mean for the co-op's remaining member farmers. Then he called Ellie. She was in her workshop when his truck came up the lane. She saw it through the window. She set down the tool she was holding and wiped her hands and walked out to meet him. They stood in the farmyard in the April light, the same April light they had stood in for 30 years, of the ordinary contact of people who share a county and a history and have never fully spoken about either. He was older hair, entirely white, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has stopped taking his body's cooperation for granted. She looked at him and felt nothing theatrical, no triumph, no anger. The 30 years had burned those things off long ago, leaving something quieter and more accurate. He spoke first. Ellie, the co-op is in trouble. I think you probably know that. He paused. He looked at the fields behind her, at the dark soil and the early emergence of the spring planting. Hartwell came to see us. Brian Stokes. They want to use the co-op as a distribution hub for the expanded Garnet Crown network. More storage, more regional reach. He stopped. He could not quite form the request directly. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has arrived at a place he has been dreading and is not sure he was right to come. I came to find out if there was a conversation to be had. She said, "Come inside." The kitchen was the same kitchen. The green glass lamp was the same lamp. His journals were on the same shelf. She put water on without speaking. She did not perform hospitality or hostility. She simply did what you do when someone has come into your kitchen, which is make them coffee. And while the water heated, she went to the cabinet above the desk and opened it and took down a folder she had not opened in years but had never moved. She opened the folder on the kitchen table. She found the letter without searching. She knew exactly where it was because she had put it back in the same position the first time she read it in the winter of 1988, and she had never moved it since, and she had known since that winter that this letter had a purpose beyond simply existing in the folder. She set it on the table in front of Douglas. He looked at it. He looked at his own handwriting from 34 years ago, the careful and confident cursive of a man who had been certain of what he was saying and had wanted to say it well. She watched him read it. The letter said, "Dear Walter, and I want to speak to you plainly as a friend and neighbor. The specialty corn project has real scientific interest, but I am genuinely concerned that you are allowing it to take priority over decisions your farm cannot afford to defer. I have looked carefully at the yield projections and the input cost calculations, and the numbers do not support the investment of your best ground in a crop with no established market. Your farm needs to produce at commercial scale, Walter. I am asking you as someone who has known you for 20 years and who has genuine respect for your intelligence and your commitment to this land to let this particular experiment go before it becomes something larger than an experiment. There is still time, the land is good, plant it with something the market can use." Douglas Holt put the letter down on the table. He looked at his hands. He did not speak for a long time. She let him sit with it. The kitchen was quiet. She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table where she had sat 30 years ago reading 8 words and deciding to plant corn that nobody wanted in a drought year with 90 days on a bank, lean and no buyer. She let the letter do what a letter can do when the person reading it is looking at it honestly. The letter said everything. The farm outside the window said everything. The network of 7 family farms she had pulled back from the edge said everything. The bottles of Garnet Crown Reserve with her father's name in the product description said everything. The plant variety protection certificate in her father's name filed by a young man from Louisville who had understood that the work deserved protection and had arranged it without being asked said everything. She did not need to add to what was already being said in the room. When Douglas finally looked up, his eyes held the specific exhaustion of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of a mistake he has been carrying for a long time without fully looking at it. "I know," he said. His voice was barely a voice. She set her hands on the table. She said, "The co-op won't work as an intermediary on Garnet Crown. The pricing structure I have with my growers doesn't accommodate that kind of overhead margin. The premium reaches the farmers directly. That's how the model works, and I'm not going to change it." He nodded. He had known this before he came. "But I've needed additional storage capacity for 2 seasons. She said, "Your facility on the county road is underused. I'll lease it from the co-op at fair market rate on a long-term basis. It's not enough to solve the co-op's larger problems, but it's real revenue, and it buys time." Douglas looked at her. She watched him understand that she was offering more than he had come with any right to expect. "Why?" he said, genuinely. She thought about it. She thought about Roy Kowalski paying bills without being asked. She thought about Marcus Delaney filing federal paperwork in her father's name, waiting 6 months to tell her, describing it as simply filing paperwork when it was much more than that. She thought about Earl Halverston accepting her offer without negotiating, and about the 7 farm families who had a future now that they had not had before, and about her father at this desk in the long evenings, writing in his journals about things the world had decided were not worth writing about. "Because the point was never to prove you wrong," she said. "The point was to grow the corn. He left an hour later. She stood in the doorway of the farmhouse and watched his truck go down the paved lane. She had paved it the year she bought the Kellerman place. It had been gravel the last time he drove it regularly. Small evidence of 30 years of change. She went back inside. She sat at her father's desk. She looked at the journals. She looked at the green glass lamp that she had replaced the bulb in 4 times over 30 years, but had never considered replacing. She opened the last journal to the page she had written on 2 entries below his 8 words. The soil remembers what we have forgotten. I planted it. Now I have to learn to grow it. Below that, in different ink from a year she no longer remembered, precisely a 3rd entry in her own handwriting. I learned. She looked out the kitchen window. Daniel was in the east field doing the morning walkthrough, moving through the rows of garnet crown that were just beginning to emerge from the spring planting, touching plants and looking at the soil, and pausing in the particular way his grandfather had paused, the way of someone who is not just looking at what is visible, but listening for what is not. He was 27 years old. He had grown up on this farm watching his mother do the work, and he had absorbed from that, watching the specific knowledge that can only be absorbed by watching the knowledge of how to pay the kind of attention that tells you what you need to know before a problem announces itself. He had his grandfather's eyes and his mother's quality of persistence, the persistence that is not stubbornness, but conviction, the understanding that if the thing is right, then the work of proving it right is the work, and the work is enough. She had stepped to one side of the primary management in October, not out. She was 54 and healthy and not remotely interested in the kind of retirement that consisted of stepping back from the things that gave life its shape and meaning. But she had stepped to one side which was different from stepping out, and the difference mattered. She went out to walk the fields with him at the end of the day, when the light was going down behind the western tree line and the October stubble was gold in the last of it. The combines had finished 3 days ago. The grain bins were full. The season's work was complete. They walked the east fence line, the same fence line she had stopped at in 1988, to look at the difference between her fields and Jerry Faber's, the surviving and the struggling, the deep-rooted and the shallow. Jerry had sold his farm to Agricor in 2003. The land was still there. The fence line was still there. The difference between the two sides of it was still visible to anyone who knew how to look. "I've been reading the journals," Daniel said. He was walking slightly ahead of her, the way she had walked slightly ahead of her father on these same rounds when she was young. "I know," she said. "The 3rd year of trials, the drought year, he wrote that he almost quit, that the yield was even lower that year than he'd projected, and he couldn't see the path forward." He paused. He was looking at the stubble the way farmers look at harvested fields, already seeing next season in it. He said the only reason he kept going was that he didn't know what else to do with the ground. She smiled. She had read that passage many times. It was the most honest thing in the journals, the admission that persistence is not always strategic, that sometimes you keep going because stopping requires a clarity about the alternatives that you do not yet have. "He didn't have a plan," Daniel said. "He just had the corn." "That was enough," she said. They walked in silence for a while. The evening air had the particular smell of harvested ground, the richness of healthy soil at the end of its productive season, the smell of something that has done its work and is resting before it begins again. The tree line to the west went dark against the sky. The farm sat in the quiet of an October evening that had been earned. "Do you think he knew," Daniel said, "that it would become this?" She thought about this carefully. It deserved a careful answer. "I think he knew the corn was right," she said. "I don't think he knew what right would eventually mean. I think he believed in the corn because the evidence he had warranted believing in it, and the rest of the market and the buyers and what it would eventually become. I don't think he could have imagined that. I don't think he needed to. The corn was enough to believe in." "Are you certain," Daniel asked, "about what comes next?" She looked at the farm around her, the bins and the barns and the workshop and the farmhouse with its new roof and its old smell, and the desk inside with the journals and the green glass lamp. 640 acres of land that 4 generations of her family had worked, and that the 5th was beginning to take hold of, and that the 6th she had reason to believe would continue. "Certain," she said. "No, but I know the soil is good. I know what it remembers. That's been enough to work with. I expect it still will be." They turned back toward the farmhouse along the farm road, the gravel of it familiar under her boots in the way that only ground you have walked thousands of times becomes familiar, registering in the body as much as in the eye. Daniel walked slightly ahead. The light was almost gone. The first stars were appearing over the eastern edge of the fields. Inside on her father's desk, his last journal lay open to the last page. The 8 words were still there in his handwriting, exactly as he had written them, slightly shakier than the pages before, but clear. Still clear, still exactly what he had meant. Beside the journal placed there that morning, when she had taken it down from the shelf to look at it, stood a bottle of Garnet Crown Reserve. The Hartwell label, embossed with a small, stylized crown of dark garnets. The front of the label carried the brand name and the age statement. The back carried a paragraph of text that she had been consulted on, and that read, "Named for the open-pollinated variety developed by Iowa farmer Walter Marsh over 15 years of careful selection, beginning in 1973. Brought to commercial production by his daughter Eleanor. Made from grain grown in the same soil Walter worked for 40 years. A story of what the American land holds when someone has the patience to let it speak." She went inside. She put on the kitchen light. She looked at the journal and the bottle side by side on the desk where he had sat every evening for 40 years, writing down what he knew about soil and roots, and what it meant to believe in something the world had decided was not worth believing in. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the farmhouse. The smell of pipe tobacco was fainter now than it had been 30 years ago, but it was still there. It had not entirely left. Some things present long enough become structural, written into the walls, part of the record. She left the journal open. She left the lamp on. She went to start dinner in the kitchen, where she had read the 8 words for the first time 30 years ago, in the night after the funeral alone, and 24 years old and not yet certain she could do what needed to be done. She had not been certain. She had planted anyway. Behind the east barn and the grain bins her father had built, and that she had maintained and expanded over 30 years, 31,000 bushels of Garnet Crown waited in the same darkness they had always trusted. Red at the crown, mottled white at the tip, shading to almost purple at the base. Deep-rooted and patient and stubborn in the weight of things that have been bred across 15 years and 30 harvests to find water where other things give up looking. The soil remembered. It had never stopped. It would not stop. That was the nature of what soil remembers. It does not forget, because forgetting is not a thing the ground knows how to do. It holds what it has been given. It returns what has been cultivated in it. It answers in its own time and in its own language to the people who have been patient enough to ask the right questions and humble enough to wait for the answer. Her father had known that. She had learned it from him. Daniel was learning it now in the way that essential things are learned not from the books or instruction, but from the repeated contact of feet with ground and hands with growing things and seasons with each other across years enough to see the pattern. The lamp was on inside. The kitchen window glowed warm in the October dark. The fields lay quiet around the farmhouse, resting in their harvested stubble, already holding in their patient soil the memory of this season and the preparation for the next. It was enough. It had always been enough. The work was what you did when you believed in something, and the believing was what you built by doing the work, and the corn was the evidence of both red and patient and deep-rooted remembering everything the world had tried to make it forget.